howdy. Welcome back to another episode of cEDH Academy, episode 3, and today we'll be talking about a lot more simpler win condition than episode 2 with Underworld Breach. This one lacks a lot of variety and comparison, but it still certainly wins games. Today's tutorial is going to be talking about Food Chain. Food Chain is an enchantment that costs 2 and a green, and what it says is you can exile a creature you control and add an amount of mana equal to that creature's mana value plus 1 to your mana pool. That mana can be of any color, however, it must only be spent to cast creature spells. In moments of desperation, this could be used to exile general purpose creatures to be able to ramp into bigger creature values, but you're in a pretty rough state if that's going to be your game plan. Almost always, Food Chain is paired with Squee the Immortal, Mist Hollow Griffin, and Eternal Scourge, in that order of value. All 3 of these creatures can be cast from exile, therefore you can generate infinite mana to cast creatures with. Before I cover which creatures we want to keep casting, which will be basically creatures from the command zone, we'll go ahead and cover why these creatures are being used in this particular order, of Squee being the most valuable, then Mist Hollow Griffin, and then Eternal Scourge. We'll start from the bottom with Eternal Scourge. 3 generic mana makes it easy to cast and can be done in a mono green deck or a deck of any color including green. You may cast it from exile, of course, as we've covered, and whenever Eternal Scourge is targeted by any spell or ability that an opponent controls, you exile it. It makes it pretty easy if you have Eternal Scourge out first and then you cast Food Chain later. If someone tries removing Eternal Scourge in response to Food Chain on the stack, it doesn't really do anything because you can still cast Eternal Scourge from exile. It might just slow down the player a little bit, making them have to pay that 3 mana to recast Eternal Scourge to then start the loop. At that point though, they're going to generate infinite mana if there's no other interaction. They'll just sacrifice some other creature if they need the mana that badly. This is everything you want for the Food Chain game plan, which is why of course it is still a very good creature to run for Food Chain, especially if you don't have red or blue in your color identity. Next, we'll be going over Mist Hollow Griffin. This is 2 and 2 blue, 4 mana total, for a flying 3/3 that you can cast from exile. This doesn't have the same protection that Eternal Scourge has, so if someone tries removing this in response to your Food Chain by destroying it specifically, not by exiling it, or by bouncing it back to your hand, that can certainly be disruptive. At first glance, you might think this makes Eternal Scourge even better, especially since it's 3 generic mana to be able to cast and not needing your 2 blue pips that you want to use on counter spells. However, when you try to resolve your Food Chain, people are going to want to try to fight over it. If that's the case, then you can use something like Force of Will, Force of Negation, Misdirection, or even Commandeer. Since blue is in your identity anyway, at cEDH you'll be running almost guaranteed Force of Will. It is basically a staple in every deck. Force of Negation is nearly a staple. In almost all cases you'll see it. Misdirection is one of those additions if you want more interaction. Commandeer is a little bit more of a spicy include, but still is seen regularly enough that it's worth being considered. All 4 of these interaction spells at instant speed can help protect your Food Chain while also pitching your Mist Hollow Griffin to exile as a way of casting these counter spells for free. This all works out great because that protects Food Chain, cast Mist Hollow Griffin from exile after this resolves because you protected it, using itself to protect its own win line combo. The strength that Mist Hollow Griffin has as being part of fodder to the counter spell being free, as well as fodder to the Food Chain to generate infinite mana, makes it a little bit stronger than Eternal Scourge. And if you only have room for one of these in your decks and you have blue, almost always you'll be going with Mist Hollow Griffin, though sometimes you can justify running both depending on your list and how heavily you want to lean into the Food Chain strategy. Next, we have the strongest of the 3 exiled creatures, that's Squee the Immortal. For 1 and 2 red pips, you can cast this creature from exile or from your graveyard. That last part is what makes this especially stronger than the other 2 options. We've already covered how valuable it is to cast it from exile for Food Chain, but if someone tries countering Squee the Immortal or gets milled at some point or gets destroyed in response to Food Chain, that doesn't stop you at all. You can just keep on casting Squee even from your graveyard. This reliability for Squee makes it so much better than the other 2 options. If you try casting Mist Hollow Griffin or Eternal Scourge and either of these spells get countered, they would go to the graveyard and you need some way of recurring these back to be able to continue winning. Now of course there is a possibility and a high likelihood that someone would actually counter the Food Chain instead of the creature due to non-creature spells being easier to counter. A pretty solid backup plan people have figured out for this is even if Food Chain does get countered, you can't win the counter war for that. You can just use a land such as Shifting Woodland. Shifting Woodland is a very popular land that can just turn itself into a Food Chain. It does require the Delirium cost, however getting 7 cards in your graveyard at cEDH pretty easy to do in the first few turns. Once you turn your Shifting Woodland into a Food Chain, you can then resume the combo as if nothing ever happened. There's other graveyard recursion options you can use, but Shifting Woodland is one of the easiest because it's just an activated ability on a land, very hard to interact with from other players. Awesome, so we figured out how we can get infinite creature mana of any colors we want from this combo. What do we do with that mana now that we have it? You pretty much have to have an outlet through your command zone for this to be viable, because exile exiling creatures only works in loops if it's the creatures that you just generated infinite mana from, or a commander you can infinitely access after exiling it. One of the premier options for food chain right now is the Tali Primal Conqueror. It's one of the top decks in the meta for a big reason, because as soon as it gets into the battlefield, it instantly finds a lot of value in almost all scenarios, very rarely whiffs, and can repeatedly copy itself indefinitely. But if you have the food chain combo, you don't have to repeatedly worry about copying the Tali. You can instead just do infinite mana through exiling Squee over and over, and just keep recasting Tali until the opponent's libraries are completely exiled. You've casted all their spells, you've found some win at some point through their libraries. Another very popular option is Atraxa, Grand Unifier. Atraxa's been around for a while as one of the premier food chain commanders, because as you just keep recasting Atraxa, you keep drawing through your entire deck, and you'll eventually get to the point they can convert into some win in some way. You have the colors for Thassa's Oracle win, you have ways of creating infinite mana in these colors, plethora of options that you can do once you draw out your entire deck. Of course, that food chain mana can only be used on all the creatures you get from Atraxa, but those creatures plus free mana rocks and rituals, etc. will find you a win along the way. Another commander in my personal favor is Lumra, Bellow of the Woods. Lumra does a lot of land looping chains. Shifting Woodlands, of course, is in that deck, and if you repeatedly cast Lumra, you eventually will mill out your entire deck until you have all your lands onto the battlefield. Those are 7 ways you can infinitely loop them, constantly do infinite pings to kill out your opponents through Sunscorched Desert. The newest food chain commander to enter the arena is Marlin, Fey Ascendant. Released from the very recent Lorwyn Eclipse set, she gives the option that every time she enters the battlefield, you can exile the top 2 cards of target opponent's library, and you can cast one of those as long as the mana is equal or less than the amount of elves and fairies you control. Even if you only have Marlin as your one elf or fairy, you'll be able to, at the very least, exile all of your opponent's libraries to the point where they won't have any access to anything at that point, and you'll find some 1 or 0 CMC spells to be able to cast along the way to generate a lot of value for yourself that you should be able to translate into a win on the spot, if not at the very worst scenario, passing and watching them die on the draw step. Marlin's pretty similar to Tali, but instead of being a Gruul commander, red plus green, she's a Sultai commander of the blue, green, and black. Both commanders work in the way that if you do the infinite food chain line with mana, you'll be able to infinitely exile all of your opponent's libraries and get value from it. At the very worst scenario, pass and watch them die on the draw step, but most likely you'll find a win along the way. Tali is certainly a faster commander. Marlin's a lot more resilient. Lumra offers a very unorthodox strategy by winning through lands, and Atraxa offers a lot of the tried and true standard good stuff in cEDH minus the red. There are other food chain commanders such as Rocco, Ukin, etc. that are viable in the meta. It's just a lot to go over and takes away the focus from food chain itself. One side note I want to mention about Lumra Bellow of the Woods is food chain is almost always a value piece for this deck, because the only actual option you have is Eternal Scourge, which does absolutely nothing for the rest of your game plan. It's not blue to pitch for any counter spells. There's only a mono green deck. You don't have Squee in your graveyard. It's a little bit harder to get this going, especially since the deck has very low draw. So getting Eternal Scourge into hand and actually having it on the battlefield afterwards is very clunky, and a lot of people don't run Eternal Scourge. In fact, I'd be shocked to see if somebody actually ran Eternal Scourge in their list. What Lumra does instead is they'll sacrifice Lumra herself to food chain to give yourself 7 mana total, and as long as you find 1 other mana somehow, you can recast Lumra and hope that you can find enough lands to be able to generate enough mana to keep doing this loop, and have food chain as a supplemental effort to help relooping Lumra. Of course, this gets a lot easier if you find the land Field of the Dead, because it's a lands-based deck. Field of the Dead will give you a lot of zombies to allow you to be able to sacrifice the zombies as the lands get looped in to help make it a lot easier to recast Lumra. However, Lumra as a food chain commander is a lot less deterministic than the other decks mentioned, because they don't have those creatures they can keep looping for infinite mana. You have to hope that you can chain this into enough mana to find the win. But again, this is a deck that's very unorthodox and hard to interact with, therefore is still a very good food chain commander. It's just not one of the food chain commanders. It's one of my favorite commanders, so I'm mentioning it anyway. So to recap with how you win with food chain, you cast food chain first, or one of these creatures, Eternal Scourge, Misthala Griffin, or Squee the Immortal first. Either way, you want both of these out here and somehow accessed through Shifting Woodlands, whatever it may be. You just go ahead and repeatedly cast whatever creature you're sacrificing out of these 3 until you get infinite creature mana, and then you convert that into a win by casting one of your commanders that give you an ETB effect that gives you enough value to find a win through that. If you like this video, please give me a like, a comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think about food chain and its current state in the meta. It certainly does still win games, though it's a little bit more risky and a little bit more fragile than some other win conditions such as Underworld Breach and Thassa's Oracle, but it's still a very fun win condition nonetheless. But in any case, thanks for watching. I appreciate you.